All right. I want to discuss today a commonly known saying, actually coming from the Tanya. I'm sure everybody heard of this term, but I don't know to what extent we appreciate what it means and how that actually works. And that is, Moyach Shalit al Halev. Everybody heard of this quote? That the Moyach, the brain, the mind, rules over the heart. And the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya that this principle, that the mind rules over the heart, is a natural principle. In other words, this is not a union that you have to create in yourself. Because of Avodas Hashem, you overpower your heart with your mind because you're an Avodas Hashem. But in fact, this is a natural phenomenon. By nature. So, if this is true, that Moyach Shalit al Halev B'tevatul Dosei, by nature, because that's the way it's created, that's the way it says in Tanya. Why is it that we have such a difficult time getting to it? When we come to the question of Moyach Shalit al Halev, it becomes a real challenge. It should be a natural thing. The answer is that we do not really employ our moyach. We do not really know what the Alter Rebbe is talking about when he says moyach. If we knew what moyach is, and we experienced moyach, then it would be automatically, naturally, that Shalit al Halev, that would rule the heart. And this is the principle I want to talk about. What do we mean by moyach? And then we'll understand moyach Shalit al Halev. Certain points that we're going to discuss today in explaining the union of moyach over the many months and years, year and a half, that we are talking, we've discussed it, certain aspects, from different angles. There are very different ways that a person relates and understands and knows the world around him. In simple terms, we say that there are 5 senses, 5 chushim, 5 senses. The simplest and the lowest one of them is touch. Then there is shmiach, mareach, smell. Then there is taste. Then there is shmiya, hearing. And the finest and the highest one, and the most revealing one, is re'iyah, is sight. With these 5 chushim, the world comes to reality to us. Now there is an interesting thing. We know that a child also has these 5 chushim. And I'm talking about a child at any age. As the child grows from infancy into childhood and then progresses through adolescence and so forth, these 5 chushim, these 5 senses, acquire different degrees of importance. If anybody doesn't understand a word that I say, please stop me, because I really would like to convey the message here. An infant, baby, clearly we don't mean an infant of one day, but a baby, as soon as it begins to crawl around and feel its way around, if you observe a baby, everybody knows this, that whatever the baby sees, the first thing he wants to do is to touch it. And then touching it is not enough. It wants to taste it. And when it tastes it, then it knows exactly what it is. By looking at it, it's not impressed. Touching is closer to reality. But when he puts it in the mouth, then he really knows what he's got in his hand. Okay. If you give the baby a picture of the Rebbe, where's the picture going to go? In the mouth. Not because it's going to kiss it, it's going to eat it. It's going to taste it. And we'll come back and then try to understand what is going on. As the child grows, he no longer needs to taste everything. And there comes a point where touch alone is enough. And then there comes a point where just seeing it is enough. What transpired during this time? What happened here? To an infant, the whole world, every child, the minute the child is born, it has a sense of reality. Not an intellectual sense of reality, but it's real because it's examining the world. But to an infant, what's real is what it can taste in the mouth. Then I know I have something. Even if I'm holding it, it doesn't seem real. If my mouth, if I have it in the taste, then I really feel that there is something real in my mouth. When it grows up a little bit, the holding it in hand, the touch, is enough to convince me that there is something real here. As it grows a little further, then to see it or to hear it is also enough. When I see it, it's real enough. There's a phenomenon in the world of psychology. There's certain weakness that a person has, that there is a certain inadequacy, whatever, a certain weakness a person may have, that as he walks, instead of walking straight between two tables or two chairs, he will invariably hit one table or another. He'll hit a wall. He'll not say, there's an opening here. Why don't you walk through the opening? Something will move. He'll have to hit it. Because as long as he didn't hit it, he doesn't relate to it as a real presence. As we said in the onset, the 5 chushim, the 5 senses, one is higher than the other, meaning one is more spiritual than the other. One is more related and dependent on our intellect than the other. That which I touch, or that which I taste, for this I don't need intellectual convincing that what I see, what it is real. I feel it. When you hit your hand on the table, you don't need to convince yourself that there's a table. You really feel it on your body. Not because there's a table, because you feel it on your body. But that which you see, that's a different thing about it. For that you have to employ intellect. Even though you see it, and it's a physical experience that you see it, nevertheless, it is not something that you personally can rely on until you touch it. And in order to rely on what you see, for that you have to have a certain level of development in your intellect. What is this intellect? What is the development that takes place so that when you see it, it becomes real? The principle in this, in general, the principle of intellect, the principle in this is this. A child knows only of itself. And only that which it experiences, it knows that it exists. Something that is just there, but it doesn't experience, it has to test everything through its own being, because that's the only thing that it appreciates as reality. As a person grows and his intellect develops, he becomes aware, not just aware because it's forced on him. You could see it, I'm telling you, you could be convinced that it's there, I can prove it to you. No. As the intellect grows, he actually relates to a greater reality, to a greater truth, not through himself, but because he recognizes that there is a big reality. There is a big world. There's not just him. And that the world is real, just as real as he is. And therefore, when he looks at something, he doesn't need another conviction. He doesn't need to test it, to feel it. He sees it, that's enough. Because he knows that there is a whole big world besides himself. And that's why, as he grows, we say the chushim, the senses, develop. Even though a person essentially is born with all the 5 chushim, an infant begins to see at a very early age, not age, early months, but all the chushim are there. But you need intellect to be able to relate to them. And as a person grows, the intellect develops, and therefore his and the chushim develop, his senses develop. A person who lacks a certain sense of this intellectual perception, he in fact, when he sees 2 tables or 2 walls and he sees space between them, and he can walk very simply between them, sees it's an open space, this is a place to walk. But invariably he has to convince himself, yes, that this is a place to walk, and this is a place where you can't walk. and therefore he will invariably hit a foot against this wall or against this wall. It's such a phenomenon. Because then, when he hits it, and he feels it's real. Because his level of intellectual development, level of reality is still on the physical level, rather than on the perception level, on the sight level. In other words, what we have now discussed tells us that even on the simple physical level, just to know that there's a physical world, just to know that what I see is for real, and to be able to accept it outside, and not doubt it, and be able to perceive it and think about it and have an opinion and relate to it. Even for that, you think it's a physical phenomenon, right? I see it or I don't see it. No, it's not entirely a physical phenomenon. Even that, very, very significantly, principally, depends on our intellect. And if the intellect is not fully developed, to rely on the intellect, and I need something to convince me and to prove to me that the table is there, and the chair is there, and the room is there, then sight is insignificant. And you would have the tendency of a child to go and touch everything. This perception, still kind of talking on this physical level, this perception, this recognition, that's called this moyach power, this intellectual power, that allows us to relate to that which we see, that which we hear, to the finer senses. This intellectual power is a true power. What do I mean by this? I just want to remember these words. It's a true power. It means a true presence. What I mean is that it would seem, by observation, it would seem that the way the intellect develops is by experiment. Listen, I have seen a table many times, and every time I saw it and I touched it and it was real. Now I see it, and another time I don't have to touch it anymore. I've seen the table. In other words, it was all through experiment. Ultimately, I see it and I rely on what I see because of previous experience of touch. That's not an intellectual relationship. That's simply saying that my touch had convinced me, had proven to me that this is true. So the truth of it is still based on the experience of touch rather than the experience of sight and the intellect. The principle that we say that the intellect develops, and as a result of that we can rely on what we see, and the world comes to reality, the whole world is real, is that in fact we have a power that's called intellect, that at some point in time it wakes up. And this intellect is that which we know inherently. This is what's called the koiches, the qualities that come from the nefesh. This is something which is not known by experiment, or by experiences or something which we know inherently, intrinsically. Except it takes time for that to develop, because the brain has to become strong and so forth. But essentially, this is a real koyach hanefesh. This is what's referred to in Chassidus Chochma Bina V'Das. Because there is a real perception, a real knowledge, intrinsic knowledge that we have in our intellect. On the intrinsic level, so to speak, in the most general and more basic level, this knowledge is not of any specific kind. Not I know how big the world is, or what the weather is, or how big the sun is. That's not what we're talking about. The principle of the intellect at this level is simply that the world, and I relate to the world, not because it affects me, not because I have experienced it, not because I feel it, but because I know it's real. I know it's real in myself, not because it affects me. Because this is the reality of the human intellect. This is what sets the human being apart from the animal world. The animals, we discussed it sometimes in the past, animals also display, exhibit something that one may call an intellectual capability. They can be conniving, they can be planning to get their prey. They can sit in stealth and grab their prey. So that takes smarts. Is that what we mean by intellect? No, that's not what we mean by intellect. Human intellect. Why not? What's the difference? The difference is that the reason the animal is aware of its prey is because it's aware of itself. That's why that prey is real. If not because I need to eat it, then it doesn't exist. It sees things through itself. And then it can employ these conniving methods. The intellect that we are talking about is the sense of reality that a person has. A human being does not exist in his own skin. A human being exists in a much bigger environment, much bigger reality. Because he exists in a bigger reality, this is why everything is real to him. And he can, and with his senses, sense of sight, which is really a spiritual thing. It's nothing that touches him, doesn't feel anything, doesn't taste anything. And yet, to him, this is the most real thing. When you see something, that's the reality. I'm sorry?
That's quite cool in my head. What was that? The last one? See something, that's the reality.
The reason that when we see this, I was pointing out to the difference between what we call intellect and what we say smarts that animals have. because animals also have smarts. But that there's a categorical difference between these two. The smarts of the animal is only how he can fulfill his personal interest. How can he get this prey? But what makes this prey real? What makes him recognize there is something there? Not because there is something there, but because he knows what he can use it for. So the reality is he, not the thing that he sees. This is what makes it real to him. Whereas a person, the human intellect, means that he actually exists, he actually orients in a totally different reality. His center of being is not himself. The center of being is the whole existence. This is illustrated in halacha, in the fact that when we say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, you know that it says in Shulchan Aruch that what are you supposed to have in mind when you say Echad? Echad is a word consisting of 3 letters: Aleph, a Ches, and a Dalet. Ches numerically is 8. Dalet numerically is 4. Numerology of the alphabet, of the Hebrew alphabet, Ches is 8, Dalet is 4, and the Aleph is 1. In the Kavono of Echad, the Ches, the 8, refers to the earth, which is 1, and the 7 heavens, which is 8. So which means the dimension of up and down. The Dalet, which is 4, refers to the 4 sides, first 4 corners: east, west, north, and south. And the Kavanah in Echad is that Aleph, that the one refers to the Rebbe, so the only thing that's 1 is Hashem. That the Aleph, the Hashem, permeates and completely unites the entire expanse of space, both up and down, and into all directions. That's the kavanah of Echad. Okay? This is in Shulchan Aruch. Another thing in Shulchan Aruch, that when you say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, you're supposed to cover your eyes. Why? So that you wouldn't see out, you wouldn't be distracted. So now the question is, how do these two things come together? If you're supposed to think that Echad, that Hashem is 1 in the entire expanse of space, but you close your eyes, there's no expanse of space. The halacha should have been just the opposite. That when you say Echad, you should open your eyes, look around all over, and say, Hashem is all over. Because that's when you have up and down, and left and right, and front and back. What is the halacha? That you're supposed to close your eyes. Not only close your eyes, don't trust your eyes closed, but you have to put your hand over your eyes to cover them. Make sure that you don't peek out, and then say Echad. What's the explanation? The explanation is that in the human mind, in the human intellect, the expanse of space is intrinsic. Not the way we may think that a person, when he closes his eyes, he only knows himself. When a person closes his eyes, he knows the entire expanse of space. Because to a person, to his intellect, everything is real. The whole expanse of space is real. Even when he closes his eyes, that's when it's real. So this very briefly exposes us to the idea of the human intellect. Which means, to reiterate and clarify, that intellect is not referring to ways that I figure things out, mathematical formulas, or how I can plan, or how I can connive. That's not what the intellect refers to. Intellect refers to, the principle of intellect is that there is the reality that I relate to is not centered, is not based on myself. It's a reality which is real in my intellectual perception. Even that which I've never seen personally, certainly not touched, not heard, is also real. I'll briefly go into the point of Moyach Shalat al Halev, and then maybe go back a little bit and enhance the concept of the intellect. I don't want to miss the chance. This exposes us to the concept of Moyach Shalit al Halev, that the mind rules over the heart. And he's saying that this is a perfectly natural thing, natural phenomenon. The heart is personal feelings. Again, we're talking on a very simple level. The heart is personal feelings. The mind is the reality as I know it and in my intellectual perception. So when a person has a concern that comes from his heart, it comes from his feelings, comes from his personal interest, and in contrast to that, he has in his own mind, his own intellect, that exposes him to the reality of things. How things are real, not just from the perception or from the perspective of how it affects him, but how things are in reality. So the heart has this weakness. It needs reassurance. But the mind says, here's the reality. And when we reflect on this, we can readily see that indeed, in fact, Moyach Shalat al Halev, because the reality as he sees in his mind the reality that he sees in his mind, which has a much, much broader implication than that which affects him directly and personally. But that which is real in an absolute sense. This is the capability of the human intellect. That completely supersedes and, in effect, either overwhelms the heart or elevates the heart. Say, what are you talking about? And here's a reality. Just wanted to interject this so we would see where this is all leading. The truth is that just as a child needs convincing that what it sees and even what it holds is real by tasting, the mind also, even though he perceives the reality, there's a big world, but he also needs something to substantiate, something that ensures that which he perceives is real. And what is it that can help the mind to relate to that which it perceives?
You said that just like the senses need assurance of the reality, right? By seeing, right?
By touch.
By touch. So you're saying same way the mind needs assurance of the reality. It's
Mm-hmm.
reality.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And here is where we get exposed, and see this explains to the real depth of what's going on in a person's mind. A person, everybody experiences that, yeah, I see it and I understand it, but I don't have the strength to follow through on it. The physical world still seems to be more real, more enticing, more convincing than that which I perceive in my mind. And for this, we have a much deeper quality. Which comes hand in hand, so to speak, in partnership with this intellectual perception. The intellectual perception tells us that there is a reality on the intellectual level, not just physical. But what kind of reality is it? How do you understand it? How do you explain it? And the answer to that is that this is a reality that Hashem creates. This higher dimension, this is what we call emunah, higher dimension, that we understand that the real basis of all existence is God. This is what substantiates our intellect. This is what allows us to follow through on our intellectual perception. Otherwise, we will be continuously doubting it. Yes, this is what I perceive, and this is what we have in the world, this dichotomy, this internal conflict that a person has. Intellectually, I see one thing, and emotionally and physically, I see another thing. Because in fact, the world as our intellect perceives it has no basis unless we understand that this is a world that God creates. Then it becomes real. This is why we know that our principal awareness and knowledge of Hashem, of God, is in our intellect. Because the world that the intellect perceives does not have any substance, cannot be relied on unless we understand, oh, God makes it. Otherwise, it's not real. The physical world seems to be an entity on a reality on its own merits. Although clearly, if we try to understand it, we can see that it's not. But at first glance, it seems to be real. But that which we perceive in our intellect is so evasive, so spiritual, that it doesn't have any kind of reality on its own. So, we want to understand the intellect and the principle of Moyach Sharet al Halev. We have a very clear illustration of it in our experience with our senses of sight versus the other lower senses. Because sight also is a non-intrusive, you know what intrusive means? It's non-intrusive form. It's not like it touches you, it affects you.
We learned this morning that when a tzaddik, he looks with a good eye, and what he sees affects what he sees. So when the Rebbe sees someone, that affects them. It's like contrary to what you just said.
No, it's not contrary, because when the Rebbe sees, he sees it how Hashem makes it. But sight on its own, without recognizing that the reality which I see is Hashem doing, then it's a non-intrusive. The reason that the Rebbe's sight has effect is not that the Rebbe has some kind of supernatural powers, because the Rebbe sees it differently. The Rebbe sees it from the perspective that it's Hashem's creation, and therefore it has an effect.
So the person sees a godly person looking at him.
That's right. That's a different type of sight. And the same thing in our intellect. If we would allow our intellect to relate to the reality, to the background of intellect, which is emunah, which is our perception of faith, a perception of godliness, then our intellect would come to life. I said that if we would permit our intellect to benefit from the basis of what the intellect is based on, which is emunah, and recognition that everything has a godly source, then our intellect itself would come to life.
How do we let our intellect benefit from the emunah?
Whenever we doubt that which we perceive in our intellect, not doubt because I know that this is true or not, but whenever we feel a weakness, that I cannot follow through on intellect, I have to I fall down into the physical world. We remember that no, it is real because Hashem makes it. Now it's not just the perception world, but because Hashem makes it, and that helps our intellect to take hold and have the strength to give us guidance. This is in fact what the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, that Moyach Shalit al Halev, that this principle that the mind rules over the heart, he says, depends heavily on the fact that in the mind there is a godly spark. So it's not just the way we perceive it intellectually, but because in fact through the mind we perceive the reality of God, of God's creation, of that this is a godly presence, that the real existence of things comes from Hashem, not the world. And therefore we can then pursue our path in life as we perceive it in our intellect, not how the world presents itself to us.
Not how the world
Presents itself to us. This is the principle that distinguishes human beings from animals in general, as we spoke a long time ago. and more specifically for our purposes, this is what distinguishes Yidden from non-Yidden. Because the union of a Yid is that he lives, to him the reality of the world is defined by the Torah, not by how he analyzes the world. Just want to finish this thought. But the Yid wants to know whether if a dispute between two people, and you want to know which way the dispute is to turn, who is right and who is wrong, we look in the Torah. The Torah tells us who is right and who is wrong in this dispute. Not how we investigate and how we figure out and how we feel about the situation. Yes. Okay, you lost it.
Oh yeah. Since Goyim,
no, forget about Goyim. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in you. I want to bring this to a head, to a real practical application. Starting from bottom up, from a simple bottom up. When it comes to, let's say, eating is a physical experience. There's taste, there is satisfaction. Smell. That's right.
Taste.
Cleanliness. Looks. But as we spoke in the past, if a Yid would approach his food from the physical perspective, from the physical worldly approach, he is actually what we would call stooping. It's actually stepping down. Instead of being this human being, this great intellect, he is now going down to the physical world. He says, oh, I enjoy this physical world. And then, of course, it drags him down and he becomes more physically oriented. But, in a very simple thing, as we said many times before, that when a Yid makes a bracha on the food, and what is the principle of a bracha? principle of bracha is that I'm not eating food that I grab from the ground or from the tree. I'm eating food that Hashem made for me. Then it's a different kind of eating. Then he relates to the food at a human level, at an intellectual level. In other words, it is not food that exists because the earth is there, because a tree is there, but it's food that exists and given to me because Hashem is there. So therefore he can eat without stooping down, without losing his intellectual orientation. If this is true at this simple level of eating, you can imagine how this becomes true when it comes to make real life decisions. Where in every instance there is the physical aspect that completely covers up, completely presents itself entirely on the physical present world. And then there is the recognition, the intellectual and emunah recognition that that life has an everlasting godly meaning. Life is not my experience for today or for this year or for the 70 years. It's a godly presence. And then one is able to make decisions and make choices even in simple, so to speak, in worldly aspects, but incorporate in his decisions true values that are meaningful to his intellect and meaningful to his emunah, to his neshama. And all that is a perfectly natural phenomenon. It's not that he forces himself, but it's a natural phenomenon because moyach shal tahalach. Because the perception of reality that the moyach presents supersedes many, many times over the reality of touch and taste and smell and any kind of physical experience. It's something that gives to the human being a sense of real purpose, real meaning, which is what every human being thirsts for. This is what the human intellect desires, looks for. This is what makes a human being a human. So, although this is an extremely profound and involved topic as such, the best that can be accomplished in a session of this nature is that we should just to know and understand, to whatever degree of depth and clarity, but just to know that this is real, that the human soul is real, and that the intellect that a person has is a real source of perception, a real source of reality. And that which we perceive in our intellect is true. We just have to strengthen it and to know that the reason it is true is because Hashem is behind it. And just as a child grows up and is able to relate to that which he sees without having to touch it. In other words, without having to touch it physically and being physically convinced that it's there. Just to see it is enough. So too can we all develop and grow up and see that which we perceive with our intellect, the truth that we perceive with our intellect and our emunah, is equally convincing and equally real. And thereby we can follow through, and this is the means, this is the pathway through which the Torah comes to us, and this is the pathway through which Hashem's bracha comes to us, and hence this is the pathway through which all our successes and blessings in our life come to us. And you should all have successful and blessed lives, and much success here in the yeshiva. Yeah.
That's a question. First of all, the more we achieve this level of perception, the more you're saying we are able to receive all the blessings and just generally the truth, right? How does one develop this kind of perception? Is it as simple as studying Tanya, studying Siddur?
The perception is there.
Yeah.
The question is to identify the moments when the spark comes through, and to allow it to open up and develop. Every time that you learn, not only Tanya, every time that you learn a piece of Chumash, every time you learn a piece of Gemara, certainly every time you learn a piece of Tanya and you understand, it utilizes, and it is based on your ability on this intellectual perception. And that's how it develops.
So you're saying the more we study Torah, the more we develop this perception,
Mm-hmm.
and as a result, we will be able to rule our hearts.
Mm-hmm.
Does the Siddur have any special advantage or any kind of Torah?
Hasidus challenges this, perhaps, more than other a part of Torah. But any part of Torah that is correctly understood touches the sin.